I made an Easter cake and I was able to make it by picking up the products from Walmart. And the base is a 10-inch cake that I got from the Walmart bakery, and I'm removing the sprinkles on the top because they aren't needed for the design. And to decorate this tier, I'm pressing mini chocolate eggs into the frosting, and using a Walmart cake is a great way for beginners to learn how to cake decorate without needing to bake one, but remember to have fun with it. This top tier is a little more advanced because I baked it from scratch in special pans to create an egg shape, and I also hollowed out the middle so I can fill it with candy. I then did a crumb coat of buttercream and a final coat of chocolate ganache, and I'm smoothing this out as best as I can before adding the fondant to the cake. And the shape of this cake makes it a little more difficult to get this fondant smooth, but once it's done, I'm then adding these flowers that I use a fondant mold to create, and now it's time to put these two cakes together. So I'm adding a little support and then carefully adding this onto the top. Now I'm using a grass tip to add buttercream onto the top of our base tier, and then adding these yellow peeps around the egg, and that makes this Easter egg cake complete. So whether you're an amateur or an expert, leave a comment if you're going to give this cake a try. I made a sweethearts cake, and I made this by stacking layers of pink confetti cake, and I did this multiple times because each of the cakes will come together at the end to make the final design. After I did a crumb coat to each cake, I then added chocolate ganache and used an acrylic heart to smooth out the final coat. And to soften the edges of the heart, I'm using an acetate sheet and then adding fondant to each cake. I'm smoothing this out as best as I can because the shape of this cake is a little tricky, and I did this 3 more times with yellow, green, and orange. After each cake was covered with fondant, I then steamed the top of them before adding these stencils I created, and I filled in these stencils by using edible paint, and each stencil says kiss me, call me, love you, and be mine. Now it's time to assemble the cake, so I'm using a cake board with a threaded rod, and I'm covering it with aluminum tape and then adding support in between each cake, and that makes this sweethearts cake complete. A lot of you have noticed that I wear shirts that match the cakes that I make, and I get asked how many shirts I actually have. So now in the studio I have a rack with all of my shirts ready to go. So here's a look at all the different colors that I wear with a few of the colors missing. I made this elegant white and gold cake, and I really could see this style of cake being used for a wedding. So I did switch it up a little bit by using strawberry and vanilla cake layers, and then I'm also not using fondant, so this is an all buttercream cake. So after adding support, I'm then airbrushing this cake with gold, creating a nice ombre of white and gold. Now I'm going to do a technique that I've never done before, and that's placing pearls on the cake using a straw. And this worked out amazingly well and was really fast to do it this way. For the second tier, after adding the final coat, I'm then going to carefully stack the cake, and then I'm decorating this tier with gold leaf. Then I'm placing a gold hoop spacer before adding the top tier, and for the top tier, I'm creating a splatter design, and this part was pretty fun, but it was really messy. And for the final details, I used golden Oreo cookies, but I brushed them with luster dust because I really wanted them to be gold. Then I piped buttercream between each cookie, and then I realized that the middle tier looked a little too plain, so I went back and added a splatter design to it, and then that makes this white and gold cake complete. For this monochromatic cake, I'm using the color brown, so of course this cake had to be flavored chocolate. And I see all the comments that say I say chocolate weird, and I'm going to say it a lot in this video. So after stacking layers of chocolate cake, I'm then adding a final coat of chocolate buttercream that I'm smoothing out as best as I can, and then adding chocolate sprinkles around the base of the cake. And this will be a 2-tier cake, so I'm adding the support dowels before I add the second tier, and then I'm going to add a chocolate ganache strip around the cake. And I made this ganache a little too thin. I should have used less cream, but I still think these strips look nice. So now I'm adding chocolate whoppers around the base of the second tier, and one slipped out my hand and I thought it damaged the cake, but the cake was pretty chill, so it was okay. So to finish the design, I'm piping chocolate buttercream to the top of the cake, and then placing a chocolate truffle on top of each of the dollops. And then I'm placing different types of chocolate candy around the cake, and this will fill in some of those empty spaces. And finally, I'm adding chocolate Pockies, and that makes this all brown chocolate cake complete. So which color should I use next? This is a cake where I choose a random subject and then make a cake design around it. So this is a paint inspired cake, and I'm first stacking up the cake and then covering it with chocolate ganache. Y'all know I love using chocolate ganache, and this really sets firm and will be a really good base for when I add the fondant. So I'm using the paneling method to add the fondant instead of draping. I just find it to look a lot cleaner this way, and it's also a good way to get really sharp edges. Now I'm adding the support dowels, and no, you cannot eat these, but they're very easy to take out. And because this is a paint inspired cake, I'm starting this off like a blank canvas and then adding color to it. For the middle tier, I'm using diluted food coloring to create the different brush strokes, and to imitate paint dripping, I'm using different cake drips on the bottom tier. And I had this small bucket and I was able to include it in the design by making it look like paint was being poured onto the cake. So I attached it to a dowel and then covered that with fondant, and then I used blue cake drip to finish off the look. And for the final details, I'm using diluted food coloring for paint splatter, and then I created these brushes and paint tubes out of modeling chocolate. And that makes this paint drip cake complete. Here's another monochromatic cake, and I chose to use green this time. And because it's green, I wanted to use a flavor that's kind of similar to that, so I used mint. And I know that's a flavor that a lot of people don't like, but I actually really love mint. So for the design, I wanted to do something a little different. So I'm using parchment paper to section out the cake. That way I can add the buttercream, get it really smooth, and once I peel away the parchment, it'll leave really clean lines, and then I can do a different design on the back. So I chilled the buttercream before I'm adding these next pieces of parchment because I wanted to make sure that it didn't smudge. And then I'm adding a darker green buttercream, which is way darker than I intended, and then I'm using a grooved cake comb to give it a little bit of texture so you can really see that difference between the two. And I love how clean the line between the colors actually came out because this is a technique that I really haven't done before. So to add to the design, I'm using different shades of green buttercream with different piping tips, then adding a white chocolate ganache strip that I colored green, and that makes this all green cake complete. So now which color should I use next? I'm making my oldest sister's birthday cake, and she loves the color purple, so I thought it would be kind of funny if I made the entire cake purple, including the cake layers, the frosting, and any decorations on top. So for the bottom tier, I used different shades of purple with different piping tips to completely cover the cake with this buttercream design. And because the bottom tier has a lot going on, for the top tier, I decided to go more simple by just covering the cake with purple buttercream and then using a grooved cake comb to give it texture. And because I'm trying to add as much purple as possible, I'm adding a white chocolate ganache drip that I colored purple and then adding these buttercream dollops on top. And the last detail was to add the purple sugar pearls to the cake, and that makes the cake complete. And now it's time to take it over to my sister's party, and she was not expecting the cake layers to be purple too, which was surprising, and she really loved it. And now I'm thinking about making this a series, so let me know which color I should use next. I made a cake using pumpkin spice Oreos, and I created it to taste like a pumpkin pie. So I stacked up layers of pumpkin spice cake and filled it with pumpkin cream cheese, and because this is a double barrel cake, I'm adding dowels in for support. And for the final coat, I'm using pumpkin spice Oreo buttercream for the top half, and for the bottom half, I'm using vanilla buttercream and using a grooved cake cone for design. And now I'm adding a sprinkle blend around the bottom of the cake, and then adding a white chocolate ganache strip. And to complete the design, I'm adding pumpkin spice Oreo cookies along the top of the cake and then piping vanilla buttercream in between each cookie. And the final details are adding crushed cookies on the top of the cake and painting the edges of the white buttercream gold. And that's his pumpkin spice Oreo cake complete. I'm not sure if you've ever noticed, but for every video that I make, I always change the background depending on what it is that I'm making. And since Christmas is coming up, I'm changing all the candy in my jars to Christmas related candy. Then I also changed the lights on the wall to red and green. And then to match the theme, I also added some Christmas decorative pieces on the shelves. So now that all of this is done, I'm now ready to make some Christmas cakes. I recently teamed up with Fiverr to make packaging for my cakes because after I finish them, I always give them away. So I reached out to a freelancer on Fiverr and told them that I needed cake boxes, and I told them the sizes that I need, and then I also sent my brand colors in my logo. I also sent a few examples of other packaging that I've seen just for reference, and because I have a very minimalistic style and it's something that I like to show in my cake designs, I wanted to make sure that the cake boxes also reflected that. So after a few messages with the freelancer, we both came to an agreement on the cake box design, and the very next day I got the finalized digital version of the design in the mock-up. So this is the final version of the cake box, and it has a very minimal design and it really reflects my style, and I couldn't be happier with it. So visit fiverr.co/sweetunpack to see the services available to you and use code SWEETUNPACK to save 10%. So I had the opportunity to make a cake for Steve Harvey, and it was such an amazing experience to have a cake presented to him and for him to try it in front of me and actually enjoy it. So I heard he liked chocolate cake, so I did a 3-tier cake, and each tier had a different geometric design because it's honestly one of my favorites to do. And in the interview, he asked me how I got started and what made me want to start cake decorating, and it's something that I always say, just something that I randomly started doing, something I did for fun. and something that I now love to do. So once I had all the cakes covered in fondant, I stacked them all carefully and I started the design process. So this middle tier took the longest to do just because I had to place each triangle by hand and make sure that they were fitting perfectly. And for the top tier, I added hexagons, and for the bottom tier, I added rectangles in a staggered pattern. And lastly, I added the Steve on the Watch logo on top, and that's the cake complete.
Boy.